Rather than engaging the army directly, strategy was one of hindering and weakening them. Daniel H. Wells, Lieutenant General of the Nauvoo Legion, instructed Mayor Joseph Taylor, on ascertaining the locality and route of the troops, proceed at once to annoy them in every possible way. Use every exertion to stampede their animals and set fire to their wagon trains. Burn the whole country before them and on their flanks. Keep them from sleeping by night surprises. Blockade the road by felling trees and destroying river fords wherever you can. Watch for opportunities to set fire to the grass on their windward, so as, if possible, to envelop their trains. Leave no grass before them that can be burned. Keep your men concealed as much as possible, and guard against surprise. Mormon pioneers began settling in what is now Utah, but then part of Alta California in the Centralist Republic of Mexico in the summer of 1847. The Mormons, now known as members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, left the United States after intense and violent conflict in search of religious freedom. One of those religious freedoms was the practice of plural marriage, also known as polygamy, where a man might have more than one wife. Many people in the United States found this upsetting and could not tolerate it. Also, in a time before telegraph allowed communication over long distances, many rumors persisted that the Mormons were planning insurrection against the United States. Some politicians even coined the phrase the Mormon problem and used it as a tool to try to distract citizens from the ongoing debate over slavery. It's worth noting that the Mormons were not unpatriotic. In fact, they brought the United States flag with them, and shortly after settling, petitioned for statehood. A good number of the men had also served in the army during the Mexican-American War in what was known as the Mormon Battalion. And church doctrine actually holds that the Constitution of the United States is inspired of God, and mankind has a sacred duty to defend and uphold it. The Utah War, also known as Buchanan's Blunder, was an unusual conflict between Mormon settlers and 2,500 federal troops sent by President James Buchanan. It lasted from 1857 to 1858. The Mormons were afraid that this large military force was being sent across the plains and over the Rocky Mountains to exterminate them. This was not an unreasonable conclusion on their part, because they had already faced an actual extermination order issued by Lilburn W. Boggs, governor of Missouri, when they lived there in 1838. And they were also aware that the army had massacred Native American villages. So they made plans to defend themselves and their lands. Although bloodshed was to be avoided, if at all possible, the Mormons repaired firearms, forged farming tools into bayonets, and sharpened long unused sabers. Fearing the worst, church leader Brigham Young ordered the residents to prepare for evacuation. They made plans to burn their homes and property, as well as stockpiled food and cattle feed. All missionaries serving in the United States and Europe were called home. On July 18, 1857, U.S. Army Captain Stuart Van Villay, an assistant quartermaster, and a small escort were ordered to proceed directly from Kansas to Salt Lake City, ahead of the main body of troops. On his journey, reports reached Van Villay that his company might be in danger from Mormon raiders on the trail. So this brave captain chose to leave his escort and proceed alone. Upon his arrival in Salt Lake City, he was welcomed cautiously by the Mormon leadership. Van Villay had been previously known by the Latter-day Saints in Iowa, and they trusted and respected him. However, he found the residents of Utah determined to defend themselves. He interviewed leaders and townspeople. He attended Sunday services. He heard emotional speeches and saw the Latter-day Saints raise their hands in unanimous resolution to guard against any invaders. But Villay found it impossible to persuade the church members that the army had peaceful intentions. Brigham Young told Van Villay that the Mormons did not desire war, and If we can keep the peace for this winter, I do think there will be something turned up that may save the shedding of blood. Upon returning to the main body of the army, Van Vliet reported that the Latter-day Saints would not resort to actual hostilities, but would seek to delay the troops in every possible way. He also reported that they were ready to burn their homes and destroy their crops, so any invading army would find nothing but desert desolation and see no reason to stay. Then he continued on to Washington, D.C., where he reported on the situation in the West and became an advocate for the Latter-day Saints until the end of the Utah War. The Nauvoo Legion, which was a militia created when the church lived in Illinois to defend the members, finally made contact with the federal troops in the wilderness in late September. The militia immediately began to burn the grass along the trail and stampede the army's cattle. Militia members would sit atop canyon ridges and take pot shots at the ground in front of horses in an attempt to spook and slow them down. They dammed rivers to make crossing difficult and cut down trees across the trail. In early October, militia members burned down forts along the plains so they couldn't fall into the hands of the army. A few days later, 3 large army supply trains that were trailing the main army detachment were burned by Mormon cavalry. Horses and cattle were liberated from the supply trains and taken west by the militia. Few, if any, shots were fired in any of these exchanges, and the army's lack of cavalry left them exposed to the Mormon raids. The army began to grow weary of these constant Mormon harassments throughout the fall, and many of the troops lost their enthusiasm to continue. This was not what these mostly young men had enlisted for. They were gung-ho, they wanted to fight. Instead, all they could do was trudge grudgingly along the trail and go to bed hungry many nights. At one point, a colonel mounted 100 men on army mules to combat the Mormon militia. In the early morning of October 15th, this group, which had been labeled the Jackass Cavalry by the Mormons, had a run-in with Mormon defenders, and they fired over 30 bullets at the Mormons from 150 yards. Nobody was killed, but one Mormon took a bullet through the rim of his hat, and one horse was grazed. The next army tactic was to lead the troops around the Mormon defenses, entering Utah from the north, but they were forced to turn back upon running into a heavy blizzard. The Mormons saw this as divine intervention on their behalf, sort of like the plague sent on Egypt to convince Pharaoh to let the Hebrew slaves go free. The troops then settled into ill-equipped winter camps, waiting resupply and reinforcement, and preparing to attack the Mormon positions after the spring thaw. Brigham Young instructed that they should be watched and, if necessary, supplied with enough nourishment to get them through the winter so that no soldiers would die. In this difficult and embarrassing condition, the army sent a series of progressively more aggressive leaders to take command of the troops in hopes of accomplishing their objective of taking control of Utah territory. A number of other attempts would be made to force entry into Salt Lake City, sometimes by stealth, including one attempt to travel up the Colorado River. But in the end, all of these efforts would fail. An agreement would finally be made and a compromise reached, which would satisfy both Mormons and the United States. At the end of June in 1858, the Army troops under General Johnson entered the Salt Lake Valley unhindered, riding through the abandoned streets of Salt Lake City on June 26th. A frustrated General Johnson was heard to say he would have given his plantation for one chance to bombard the city for just 15 minutes. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Ferguson Smith stated that he did not give a damn who hurt him. He would like to see every damned Mormon hung by the neck. Philip St. George Cook, who had led the Mormon battalion, during the Mexican-American War merely removed his hat in respect for the men that he had led. One newly arrived reporter from the New York Herald newspaper wrote, "Thus was peace made, and thus ended the Utah War, which may be historicized, killed none, wounded none, and fooled everybody." The troops created Camp Floyd and stayed there in 1861, when they abandoned the camp after being called back east to fight in the Civil War. You can still visit that camp today. But some soldiers would eventually return, choosing to live among the Mormons, and some Utah families even today can trace their roots to these men. And there you have it, the story of the Utah War, which really wasn't much of a war at all. If you happen to like stories like this, then you know what to do. Like the video, subscribe to my channel, and I'll keep them coming. Have a fantastic day, everybody.